The displacement in meters of a particle moving in a straight line is given by the equation of motion S is equal to 6 over t squared, where t is measured in seconds. We want to find the velocity in meters per second of the particle at times t is equal to a, t is equal to 1, t is equal to 2, and t is equal to 3. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find out what happens at v of a. So to find v of a, what we want to do is find the limit as h approaches 0 of s of a plus h minus s of a divided by h. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have the limit as h approaches 0. So let's plug in a plus h into the function. So we have 6 over a plus h squared minus 6 over a squared. And then we're going to divide that by h. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the numerators so that we have an LCD. So technically this is 6 over a plus h squared minus 6 over a squared. Okay, so we need to find the LCD between the following two functions: a squared, or the denominators, a plus h squared. Okay, so they don't have an a squared in common, so it's going to be a squared times a plus h squared. So that's going to be the denominator. So we have a squared times a plus h squared minus a squared again, using the same denominator, a squared times a plus h squared. So what do we need to multiply by denominator here to get a squared plus ah squared? We need to multiply that by a squared, multiply this by a squared. So we get 6a squared here. And then we got to multiply this denominator by a plus h squared, which is the same thing here, a plus h squared. So we get 6 times a plus h squared. Okay, so let's go ahead and simplify that a little further. So we get in the numerator 6a squared minus 6 times a plus h squared, and that's divided by a squared times a plus h squared. Okay, now if you notice over to your left, it's all being divided by h. So we don't want to leave this as a complex fraction. So the goal is to multiply now the numerator and denominator by a squared times a plus h squared, a squared times a plus h squared. So what happens? Well, we can then simplify that, and then what we get in the following, the numerator, we can distribute or at least expand this a little bit. So this is 6a squared minus 6 times a squared plus 2ah plus h squared divided by h times a squared times a plus h squared. Now let's distribute that 6. So we have 6a squared minus 6a squared minus 12ah minus 6h squared all over h a squared times a plus h squared. Now if we combine like terms in a numerator, we can see that that's going to equal 0. So now let's bring it back to the left to determine the limit. So we have the limit as h approaches 0 of negative 12ah minus 6h squared all over h a squared times a plus h squared. So we can factor out an h and a negative 6 in the numerator. So if we factor out negative 6h, we end up with positive 2a plus h, and then divide that by h a squared times a plus h squared. So now we can simplify the h. So what we have left is the following. We have the limit as h approaches 0 of negative 6 times 2a plus h divided by a squared times a plus h squared. Do that again here. So a squared times a plus h squared. Now let's evaluate the limit. So if we plug in 0 for h, in the numerator we have negative 6 times 2a since h is 0. And the denominator we're going to have a squared, which is 0 for h. That means we have a squared. So that's going to give us negative 12a over a to the 4th. But then we can simplify one of the a's. So this gives us negative 12 over a cubed, and that's meters per second. So therefore that's going to be the velocity. So the velocity at a is equal to negative 12 over a cubed meters per second. Okay, so now we determine what the velocity is at a. And now we need to find out what is the velocity at t is equal to 1, t is equal to 2, and t is equal to 3. So let's go ahead and do that. So for step 2, at t is equal to 1, okay, we're going to plug that in. So v of 1 is going to equal negative 12 over 1 cubed, which is then negative 12 meters per second. Okay, at t is equal to 2, we say v of 2 is now going to be negative 12 over 2 cubed, which is the same thing as negative 12 over 8, which is then negative 3 over 2 meters per second. And then at t is equal to 3, this would be v of 3, which is equal to negative 12 over 3 cubed, which is negative 12 over 27, which then reduces to negative 4/9 meters per second.